Today, I want to talk about SHx, and especially in relation to how it seems to be following the same kind of tokenomics strategy by implementing an escrow that Ripple did with XRP. And it's especially important right now because the SHx coin itself is now about to be on a lot more people's radar. In the last 24 hours, it is up about 28%, and for a brief amount of time, it was actually up 100%. And I will explain more about the price action in the chart, but we went from about 1.5 cents up to just under 3 cents. It is just really conspicuously timed after they rolled out the escrow. They publicly announced it. It's been picked up by a lot of XRP Army types, and it happened 1 week after the Fed wire transition into ISO 222 messaging. It also lines up with some speculation that's really not too terribly speculative about potential listings on some pretty huge exchanges. And in my own humble opinion, I don't really even think we have started a lot yet. With all of the macro and the regulations coming together at the exact same time, I think that this general trend can continue for quite a while. So with all of that said, Stronghold is now trending on CoinMarketCap for the first time. And it's probably because it pumped 100% in one day before correcting to just around a 30% gain. I did very recently talk about why Stronghold is suddenly attracting a lot more attention, specifically from the XRP Army types. And I do think that has been strategized. I do think that's not really entirely organic on its own because they all started to post about it at the exact same time. And especially because I'm sure that these people were aware of it because of all of the corporate connections into Ripple and Stellar. I was actually traveling yesterday and I was on my first flight. And when I checked the market, when I had a layover, Stronghold was going absolutely insane. And I've really been looking at charts from a different perspective. I'm not really trying to portray technical analysis here. I'm trying to portray what's actually happening in the order books. And I'm trying to replicate that because we can't easily import that kind of information into trading view indicators by manipulating correlations in between volume and other typically TA values. So it did pop up from about 1.5 cents up to about 2 cents for probably a couple of hours, and it was holding that. And then all of a sudden, it began to slowly climb up until it just popped up to about 2.4 cents, where it then went up to about 2.6 cents and it held for just a little bit before it finally hit probably about 2.95 cents, and it came back down to just about a 2 cent baseline. So, in my own opinion, I don't really think that happened on its own. I think something changed, and it's not really the correct way to explain it, but I think that someone somewhere, for whatever purpose, essentially proved a concept that Stronghold can very quickly create a lot of value without having a lot of volume. And that might be related to some potential exchange listings because the exchange doesn't really profit off of how expensive or cheap a coin is. It just profits off of the amount of volume because it takes a percentage of each order. And this right here is actually a very good point. If we look at the volume in between decentralized exchanges and centralized exchanges, which can actually be found on CoinMarketCap here, it shows that just about 25% of it came out of decentralized exchanges. And a lot of the centralized exchanges have the ERC20 version of SHx. And I have talked about how the ERC20 and the SHx on the Ethereum chain is still kind of a taboo topic when it comes to what Stronghold actually wants to talk about. And I'm not holding it against them. I've expressed a lot how I think a lot of these crypto companies, and specifically the utility ones, are in one way or another influencing where the price is at pretty much any point in time right now. And one really good example of that is how with XRP, I believe it happened in 2018, there were some emails that got sent that explained how the people in control were allowing XRP to quote unquote breathe. So I think that something happened here. And what I'll explain in the review of the chart itself and the trading view indicator I have made kind of tracks with that speculation. Here, I want to touch on a couple of the macro things before I get into what the chart is actually telling us. It appears as if Stronghold has begun to follow Coinbase Exchange. And with all of the ties that I have talked about in between Stellar, Stronghold, BlackRock, Circle, and Coinbase, that wouldn't really be too surprising, especially because in the Coinbase wallet app, you are able to purchase the ERC20 version of SHx. And the ERC20 is really where I believe that a lot of the strange price action and what I'm referring to as price control is actually happening. And I am not an expert on this stuff. I don't pretend. So I'm just using this information to tie into what I talk about. Looks as if there has been a lot of activity on the ERC20 version of SHx when it comes to Uniswap, which one of the deployer accounts from Stronghold is actually lending SHx to that specific account. And on top of that, the Stronghold account made its first transaction with an Uphold account. And with all of the ties in between Stronghold, Ripple, and Uphold, which I have talked about for probably almost a year and a half at this point, I wouldn't be surprised to have Stronghold on Ethereum and on Stellar pop up there soon. I have talked about the macro part of things a couple of times in the last 2 weeks or so, and we really are at that point in time where, historically speaking, the altcoin market has tended to go up very quickly. I do personally think that this time is a little bit different because we are in the right macro environment as well as the right regulatory environment as well, which specifically in the US could come into full effect by the end of 2025. And one more thing on that is around stablecoins. And of course, here in the US, we've had a lot of talk around stablecoin regulations, and the Genius Act passed. I believe that comes into effect in about 120 days. And the Clarity Act is also progressing as well. On top of that, we will have a market structure bill, which I believe is expected to be wrapped up by the end of September. So, what this says is that our pumps in our historical run ups have essentially just been tests, which, if you track the stablecoin deployment, that can be shown here in 2017, 2018, here in 2019, going into 2020, and then in 2021, which led into the peak in 2022. Now, the stablecoin deployment is actually beginning to turn positive on the long term trend. So, all of these slight increases and the spikes that we have experienced in the past are now just a precursor to where we are at with stablecoins becoming legal. Here's probably what a lot of people are the most interested in. And I have been looking at charts in a different way. I have had a lot of help from a person who I speak to pretty much every day. So it's really centered around the order flow itself. And instead of talking about MACD and RSI, it's really just looking at what the individual candles that are being created are trying to convey and trying to determine if you are in an accumulation period or if you are in a distribution period. And I'm a pattern recognition type. I'm kind of a math nerd just because I'm an engineer. So, just for my own education and my own confirmation, I am trying to create some custom trading view indicators that can help me be able to piece everything together just because it's so different compared to a lot of the chart talk out there. The first one I have been working on is trying to find periods of time where the volume is experiencing a higher than normal percent change. And it's not perfect because we can't get what the in and out volume is. However, I'm trying to find a creative way to incorporate that kind of an input. And it really tracks with what the order flow analysis is actually telling us, where we're just trying to identify the structure of the chart itself and determining if it is in an accumulation or if it's in a distribution. So here is what I'm working on at the moment, and the code is all here. I've basically been trying to vibe code this thing to help me on the charts, but also to just help me learn how to use AI to code things that are actually helpful. I am combining a little really simplistic TA with this approach well, just because it helps people see that the order flow analysis is actually tracking pretty well with the traditional kind of. So, yes, we were in a triangle pattern and we did pop out of that pretty much at the point where it was expected. And we had this run up from about zero point 0.3 cents in November of 2024 all the way up to just about 2 cents in January of 25, and then pretty much everything cooled off again, began to pop off in about April, and it came back down, and we have recently seen a lot more positive price action out of a lot of things. So there are some traditional TA kinds of indicators that can essentially confirm what I am trying to convey, and it might help people who are actually interested in looking at things in terms of what the order books are explaining have confidence that this is a much more simplistic and, in all honesty, a much more long-term accurate way as compared to TA, which I'll probably offend a lot of people with that. So if you look, the indicator itself is printing a green bar when we have a positive candle and we have a higher than normal change in volume. So the individual lines themselves aren't really as significant. It's when you begin to get clusters of the same color that it begins to track with what is actually happening. The green symbols here on top are trying to show when the chart could make an explosive change. And that is my attempt to apply momentum and RSI and other traditionally TA things into this order flow methodology to try to help me personally spot when things have a high potential to change up or down. So it's not perfect yet. I still have to adjust it a lot, but on average, it essentially confirms what the structure of the chart is actually telling us. So once it begins to create new positive structures, it tends to want to continue that, and eventually it will end up in a distribution before changing into an accumulation again. And here we entered another long-term distribution. We were essentially just kind of accumulating there, and then we popped off again. If we zoom into what has been happening more recently on the 4-hour chart, it did show some signs that we might experience a positive change in the structure, and it actually happened. If we look at the chart concentrating on yesterday, it did print multiple greens as well as the pre-structured change indicators, which tracked with what was happening and what was about to happen. Now, it won't always catch everything, but it's up to the individual to interpret it, and I'm still tweaking it. Now, I don't really like to look at any charts under 4 hours for what I typically talk about. However, if we look at what actually happened yesterday, it really tracks with this order flow methodology for charts. We did have some early indication of a positive change in the structure, and that continued until we entered a brief distribution where we had some really flat candles, which is not unusual when it comes to SHx, just because there's not a lot of liquidity there. And I think that there's some trading price control, especially on the ERC20. However, we did pop through that. The sellers were exhausted, and then it didn't really take a whole lot to go all the way up to just under 3 cents before we came right back down. Now, my first explanation was that some very large sell orders that were acting as a price wall were taken out of the order books, which is called spoofing. And it's a pretty common tactic across the different kinds of markets. However, it tracks specifically to SHx, especially when we're talking about the ERC20. But the indicator here is actually conveying that there was a lot of volume coming in that historically hasn't really happened. So while it may be true that there was some spoofing happening, it really seems to show that for whatever reason and for whatever purpose, there was an abnormally large amount of volume coming in to SHx that was driving the price up extremely quickly. And because it's such a low liquidity coin at this point, and it's such a low market cap coin, it doesn't really take a lot of volume to have a 100% gain. And that's really what I'm trying to convey here with what I normally talk about. But I did want to start to talk a little bit about how I've begun to look at charts as well, because it could be helpful.